So nice to have all of you here. It's a pleasure to greet you this evening. We are truly pleased to have Dr. Yolanda Pierce as our guest. You'll know why very shortly. I want to take a moment and just say that we're also grateful to those who have helped sponsor this, and that is the Evans family. You'll notice on the program a picture of and a bio on the back of Elder Richard L. Evans, in whose name this professorship that makes these events happen made that all possible. So we're grateful, as always, to have Evans family members here. And we're grateful to campus sponsoring entities, the College of Religious Education, the BYU Interfaith Student Association. Some of you belong to that. And if you haven't heard of it and you're hearing about it for the first time, please do find out about that group. They're engaged in this kind of endeavor on a regular basis. I think you would greatly enjoy interacting with them. We also have the Council of Interfaith or Interreligious Engagement, who has sponsored this. So we have a number of entities on this campus that are committed to this kind of interfaith, interreligious dialogue and conversation. We're glad all of you are here to enjoy that this evening. We acknowledge the presence of Elder Peter Johnson of the, I was going to say the first quorum, now it's the General Authority 70. What exactly? He's a 70, that's what counts. And of course, President and Sister Worthen. We have a handful of vice presidents here. We have a number of deans and chairs. We're grateful for their interest. This is not arm twisting. These are folks who have every good reason to be elsewhere in their busy schedules, but they make it a point to come and support an event. And very excited that you all have come. Look at this student group. Look around here. There's really not a seat left. And that speaks volumes, I think, about you students and your interest in what Dr. Pierce will share. And I'm confident you'll enjoy what she does bring to us this evening. So with that, we're going to continue the program as outlined. We've invited Allie Bird, I was going to say Boyd, Allie Bird to offer our invocation, after which we'll have welcoming remarks from President Worthen. We're appreciative of that. Following President Worthen, Anthony Bates, who's managing director of our new Sorensen Center. You'll hear more about that in the months and years to come. We'll introduce Dr. Pierce, and then the excitement will really begin. So, Allie, if you would, please.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful that we have this opportunity to gather together tonight and commemorate and remember Richard L. Evans. Father, we're so very thankful that we have the opportunity to hear Dr. Yolanda Pierce speak. So thankful that we have the opportunity to be enlightened and educated by her. Father, please help us to be more enlightened and uplifted and inspired by her words, that we can learn to build each other up and make things better in the world. Heavenly Father, please help us to be enlightened on the positive things in the world as well as the negative things, that we can make them better and overcome them with light and with love. Please help us to continue to fight for the things that are right, to love those who are around us. And Father, please keep us safe on this evening and help us to go forward with faith, with diligence, and with strength, and that we can take the messages that we're going to learn tonight out into the world to go and help others. And Father, we ask these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
It's both a privilege and a pleasure, if you get those words right, to be here to welcome you formally on behalf of Brigham Young University to the 3rd annual Richard L. Evans Lecture. The purpose of the lecture, like the chair for whom it's named, is really to build bridges of understanding on religious and faith issues. What a wonderful opportunity we have. It's fitting that it's named for Richard L. Evans. Many won't recognize that name, but all of you should. He was probably best known for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a general authority for 33 years, 18 of those as a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. But to the world at large, he was known as what became the voice of what became music and the spoken word. For over 40 years, there was a radio broadcast from KSL with what was then the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, now the Tabernacle Choir at Temple Square. And he was the voice, and often usually the author of those sayings. And he was very well known. One of his fellow quorum of the 12 members, when he passed away, said, "There are many in the world who boast that they belong to the Church of Richard L. Evans." So he's well known for his outreach to others and helping them understand it. So it is very fitting that we honor him and with this lecture tonight. It's also fitting that this lecture happened at Brigham Young University. For those students who are here, I'm going to remind you of the mission statement. I'm sure it's just right foremost in your mind. And the 4 major educational goals, we're only going to talk about 2 of them. The first one is that all students at BYU should be taught the truths of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We're going to be hearing some of those truths tonight about the gospel of Jesus Christ from Dean Pierce. It then says, the second one says, because the gospel encourages the pursuit of all truth, note that, again, the pursuit of all truth, that's what the gospel requires. Because of that, students at BYU should receive a broad university education that helps them so they can think clearly, communicate effectively, and understand important ideas in their own cultural tradition as well as that of others. That describes in a nutshell, I think, what this lecture is all about, what we'll hear tonight. But I also think it's fitting, and we're honored to have Dr. Pierce here with us, who embodies, again, the principles of the gospel of Jesus Christ and helps us understand maybe a slightly different cultural context in which that worship is carried out. In her wonderful book, My Grandmother's Home, she starts out at the very beginning with what I think is a description for those who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints will recognize as what I would call a home-centered, church-supported, gospel-learning environment. Listen to these words. She wrote, "In my grandmother's house, there were biscuits and hymns and stories. In my grandmother's church, there was preaching and joy and firm rebuke." Then listen to this wonderful reassuring thing that comes from that combination. She writes, "I do not fear the world that is to come, knowing that heaven may be a storefront church or apartment living room where the saints of God are gathered home, telling the story of how they've overcome, knowing that we will all understand it better by and by." Again, I think that sums up what is a home-centered, church-supported, gospel-learning environment. So thank you for all of you for being here. And I'll just close with the words that Richard L. Evans used, repeated at the end of each of the broadcasts, and still is today with music in the spoken word, the hope that may peace be with you this day and always. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Pierce. Dr. Yolanda Pierce serves as a professor and dean of the School of Divinity at Howard University, a renowned and influential historically black college and university. In 2016, she was appointed as the founding director of the Center for African American Religious Life at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Prior to her current role, she was the founding director of the Center for Black Church Studies and an associate professor of religion and literature at Princeton Theological Seminary. Dr. Pierce is a first-generation college student, and she's earned degrees from Cornell and Princeton universities. Her research specialties include literature and religion, womanist theology, and African American religions. In addition to her teaching and academic scholarship, Dr. Pierce is a dedicated mentor, community activist, board member of a foster care agency, and a cable news commentator. She maintains a public intellectual presence through her blogs and frequent appearances on television and radio. She believes that teaching and scholarship are meaningful only if they truly enhance people's daily lives. Thus, she works tirelessly to bridge the gaps between pulpit, pew, and academy. A couple students and I had the good fortune to pick Dr. Pierce up from the airport last night, and it was immediately apparent that she wants to get right to the good work at hand. She looked more like she was packed for daily errands as opposed to like a cross-country flight. I had never seen that condensed packing job, and it was amazing. Dr. Pierce shares important values with BYU that were summarized in President Worthen's most recent university conference address. And he said, "These are students. This is why we exist. This is the primary focus of our mission. At the end of the day, students are the product we produce. How they turn out, what they do, and more important, who they are, is the ultimate metric by which our work will be measured." And she is someone after my own heart. As we were talking about our roles at the university, she said, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, "You only get into the academy if you are doing it for the students." And it was obvious that Dr. Pierce exemplifies this statement. By the time she arrived to the car with the students that had come with us to pick her up, I already felt some degree of FOMO for the relationship and the conversation they developed from the terminal to the pickup lane. And that continued as she spent most of the ride mostly asking the questions to students and listening intently to them. So we are incredibly fortunate to host Dr. Yolanda Pierce here at BYU as a scholar, a person of faith, and an advocate for students and their experiences. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Pierce.
I hope I can live up to that introduction. So thank you all for being here. Let me just first acknowledge the president and his wife who are here with us, all of the senior administrators and staff and faculty and students and everybody else, all y'all. Thank you for having me. I am surprised about the presence of a dear friend from Wake Forest who just happened to be here in the area at the school at the same time. I want to acknowledge, thank you for being here. And my plus one for dinner, where is she? Oh, hey, how are you, Miss Lita? Thank you, thank you. So I want to bring you greetings from Howard University. It's a special place, and I am honored to serve as her dean. I don't know how that happened, but nonetheless, I'm honored to serve as her dean. Even though I live in Washington, D.C., I am a native New Yorker. I'm born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and that is home. And so if there are any New Yorkers here, my special shout out to you all. So I need to get right to it because I want to respect the time, and also I am 2 hours ahead, so I would be in bed. Okay. I want to talk tonight about something I've been working through in my mind as someone deeply committed to doing interfaith work. And in addition to my day job, I chaired the Interfaith Council for the City of Washington, D.C. This is a political appointment through our mayor, Muriel Bowser. If she's not reelected, neither will I be, and no problem. God says your work is done. But so I've been thinking about interfaith work for a very long time. And as someone who spends her career speaking to people, lecturing, trying to hear stories, and share my own, I have some lessons, I think, about interfaith work, but the lessons actually don't come from our current environment, but something I'm invested in deeply historically. So I say that to say to the students in the audience, at some point I will tell you, write this down. I really mean that. I'm a professor at heart. There will be a quiz. So I have stuff for you to do. There's a charge at the end. There's work. There's assignment. I flew a long way. You're going to get all of this. Okay. So Cradle and Cauldron, early Black American religion and interfaith possibilities. I begin at the beginning. as a daughter who is the descendant of enslaved persons. I begin my American story, as many African Americans do, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave trade, the transport of humans from various points on the continent of Africa to various points in what was then called the New World. I think about this journey itself, and I take a moment to acknowledge that this journey is transformative for more reasons than you can imagine. It changes the shape, the complexion, the culture of this American context. It shifts radically the possibilities on the continent of Africa, but it does something else that we often do not acknowledge, because I want to tell you that during this passage of these ships that were often named after people of faith, the greeting of seeing the flag bearing the sign of the cross, bearing the words Christ the King, being the vessel that transported human beings from their home as if they were merely objects. So I start there to set the tone for the seriousness of what this particular cultural context can provide us with in terms of how we understand the work that we do today. Because you see, something died in that journey. Something was also born. What died? What died, unfortunately, were some of the names, some of the histories, some of the peoples, some of the traditions that would never, ever again be recovered. But something else was born. Something in this liminal space, this middle of the ocean, the still African, not yet American, maybe not African, maybe will one day be American. Something is born in this space. And my question is, what survives in liminal spaces? The answer is faith survives liminal spaces. I want to dispel the myth that we often deal with when we talk about early African American encounters with the New World about religion. And the myth goes something like this, that enslaved people were brought to the shores of this nation and that they were empty vessels, that somehow by setting foot on the coast of South Carolina or Mississippi, that they met God. The reason that this is a myth is because, like people everywhere, they carried the light of God with them, and that cannot be destroyed. So this wasn't an encounter for these people when they got to the shores of this nation to say, oh, nice to meet you, God. Instead, in fact, the powerful acknowledgement that God's existence in that liminal space is what helped them to survive. The second myth to dispel is the myth of religious homogeneity. So the way the story is often told, in addition to meeting God on the shores, as if God could only be contained by the shores of this, as lovely shores as they can be sometimes, that myth also has a corollary, and that myth is, and so then everyone became Christians, and here we are. The reason that that is a myth is because it actually takes away the about 150 years of the rich religious diversity that existed among enslaved Africans in this country and in this nation, and I want to argue still exists today. This religious diversity. This quote is important. Africans brought with them their world views, call it cosmology, into North America, where in an early phase of slavery, the core understandings or sacred cosmos at the heart of these world views coalesced into one Neo-African consciousness, basically similar yet already significantly different from West African understandings. This is why it's important for you to think about what died and what lived, what was gone and what survived, what was birthed even in that passage, that Mayafa, that Holocaust. This faith that is developing. So some people use 1619 as a start date. The date itself doesn't matter. But if we just think about these first 150 years in which several things are happening historically at once for people of African descent. One, they are being transported and acclimated into a new land, a new world, a new climate, a new everything. The second part of that is that as those folks are encountering all of the religious faiths around them, they're not simply adopting them, they are transforming them. The only way that you can understand American religion is if you understand that the presence of African peoples transformed every aspect of religion that was being practiced in this nation. So this adaptation is also about adoption and transformation. And you have people who were primarily West African in origin coming to these shores, carrying with them no clothing, stripped of their names, but carrying with them a variety of beliefs and practices and traditions, the things you carry in your soul that survive despite persecution. And so, this rich religious diversity, what did it look like and why does it matter? So, what we have in this early American context are traditional African religious practices. People brought here who remembered and still practice what they had remembered and practiced for thousands of years. The stories told by the griots, the traditions kept by the elders. You don't quickly forget them. I often talk about being raised by my grandparents, and the way that I learned to pray was kneeling at my tiny little twin bed and my grandmother teaching me the words of the Lord's Prayer. I will never forget that. There's some things that we passed down. There were things that these people of African descent had received for literally thousands of years that fiery passage through the Middle Passage could not destroy. So there were folks who were practitioners of traditional African religions. Up to around about 30% of enslaved Africans who came to this country were practicing Muslims. That's important for us because we don't think about early Islam in America. Right? We talk about the Muslim presence in America as it unfolds today in various communities. We often talk about it actually in terms of immigration and various people groups coming from all over the world. I need you to know that in 1619, 1700, that up to 30% of the people who were brought here in chains were practicing Muslims. Then there were those who were already practicing Christians, which is why that myth of sort of like, coming to the coast of Louisiana and saying, oh, nice to meet you, God. They're like, actually, so God and I are already on good speaking terms, right? And so this idea of then saying, here, we have this religion for you, when some significant portion of these enslaved people already were like, no, we're good. We know Hagar. We know Jesus, right? And then we have groups of folks for whom we don't know. We don't know what their religious practices or beliefs were. But imagine this milieu, this early American context. Enslaved people brought from different people groups, different languages, different tribal groups, different areas, different ways of being in the world. And they arrive, and basically it was like, make this work. We don't think about that as the origins of the American interfaith story, but it is. It starts there with what it meant for people who were legally less than human, who were legally property, to actually have to encounter not the colonizing presence, but each other. Right? Because again, one of the ways we tell the story is about the encounter with the slaveholder and the slave owner. Instead, I'm interested in the encounter among these early African Americans with one another. How did they live and move and breathe? How did they understand God and the sacred? What did they say? How did they learn to cooperate with one another? How did they support each other? How did they worship, right? When we tell this story of interiority, then it is a story of a development of faith that can happen and exist outside of a gaze, the white gaze. Something was happening for these communities, by these communities, as they learn to live and to work with one another. So let me give you, of course, some examples. This is an image of Omar bin Said, 1770. See how early? Dies in 1864. He ends his life as an enslaved person in North Carolina. Part of why this particular story and this particular American figure is important to me is because then you start to get a glimpse into this early interfaith cooperation. He was actually born in West Africa, in a part of West Africa that is contemporary, modern-day Senegal. He was enslaved, experienced the Middle Passage, and transported to the United States in 1807. He was a practicing Muslim in Senegal. He comes to the United States. He is an enslaved man working on a plantation alongside a whole lot of other people. And what they believe happened was that after some years of being here, he actually converted to Christianity. He had a very cruel owner when he was in South Carolina. He eventually becomes a fugitive enslaved person. He ends up in North Carolina, which is where he eventually lives and dies. So the story goes is that he converts to Christianity. But he was sought far and wide because he spoke Arabic. And he read Arabic because as a practicing Muslim in Senegal, of course, he read the Quran. And how he was able to purchase his freedom is that various Christians would come to him, and these white Christians would come to him and ask him to write the Lord's Prayer in the beautiful calligraphy of Arabic. Right? And so that's what he did. He sold the Lord's Prayer, or he would write whatever scripture you wanted, the 23rd Psalm, and so it was beautiful, as many of you probably know. The calligraphy was just absolutely beautiful, and people displayed them. And so the reason we have so much evidence of his life and portraits of him is because he was well known as the Muslim who converted to Christianity and could recite the Lord's Prayer, could recite the 23rd Psalm in Arabic and in English. 150 years after the fact, as archivists are going through his records and this paperwork, and the fact that he had a picture, which is a significant thing, and that people talked about him and you could read about him, and they're going through, as the families who had preserved the beautiful script that he wrote, finally, they invited someone in who spoke Arabic. That should have occurred to them, but nonetheless, anyway. So this is well into the 20th century, and they're looking at all of this material evidence that they have, and it's very rare to have so much material evidence of an enslaved person's life. So they're like, wow, he was significant, and they're like, wow, look at this. And the Arabic speakers read what he had written, and it was never the Lord's Prayer. Now, of course, how would the person who had paid him money to do that? Now, he continued his whole life to write verses from the Quran. I love this. And I love this for a number of reasons. I love this because he continued to be who he was. I love it because the trickster piece of this, right? Which is, oh, sure, since you can't read it, oh, here you go. I kind of love that. But I also love that part of this story is actually about mutual faith cooperation, because other enslaved people protected him when he would pray 5 times a day. Because in Islam, that is the duty of every Muslim to pray 5 times a day, right? And so I think about this story and others like it to say this interfaith cooperation was absolutely necessary for both physical and spiritual and psychic survival. That the faith, as a Muslim man that he held on to, even in a place in which he would have been persecuted for that faith, right? But continued to practice it at great risk that one day somebody would actually find out. Now, it took a very long time, but and he was gone for a very long time, and someone found that out. But the audacity to continue to do that thing which fed his soul. So this faith that's developing in this early African-American context, the reason that it develops and flourishes despite restrictions, despite laws forbidding it, right? So back to the myth of, meeting God at the shores. It was actually illegal for 150 years for enslaved people to gather for worship. It was actually illegal for them to practice religion. And so in that environment of risk, the hush harbor becomes a place of safety. The hush harbor, the wilderness experiences, these outdoor places in which these men and women of African descent worshiped God in lots of different ways. Rituals, and then they remembered, and then they practiced in the hush harbors, these outdoor spaces. They practiced the ring shout, this African tradition that survived the Middle Passage journey and finds its way into the Black Baptist tradition, right? And so in these outdoor spaces, faith gets developed because nobody's watching you while you're there in the hush harbor. In fact, we have to contend with an early African American story in which the church is a danger and the outdoors is the safer space. Because that's part of our story as well. Faith becomes a means to protest, particularly to protest against slavery and against racism. This faith that's developing in these outdoor spaces and the hush harbors and in these other places where it can grow and thrive, and the music and the ritual can in fact flourish. Faith becomes a means of protest. This is a picture, many of you may know, of Richard Allen. He is the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is the first African American founded denomination in the United States. Richard Allen, along with a couple of others, including Absalom Jones, I have to say his name because there might be someone who is AME who will watch this and then you will say, you didn't say Absalom Jones' name. So, okay, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, he has a nice stained glass, I just needed a picture. Here's an example of this faith as protest. They, as enslaved persons, were allowed inside of the Methodist church, but they could not sit in the front, nor could they receive the elements of communion until after all of the white parishioners had been served. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, to protest for them, not just slavery, absolutely that, right? Not just how they were being treated in this particular church, absolutely that. But as a theologian, I want you to hear the theological protest that they lodge, which is that if we are all made in the image and likeness of God, then this communion table, this space of the element where we remember the body, we remember the blood, we remember the sacrifice. If that's real, then either everyone's welcome or no one should be welcome, right? And so what did they do? These two men took themselves to the altar and they kneeled down to pray. By doing so, they violated both law and custom. They violated the custom of African Americans not being allowed at the front of their church. They violated the custom of African Americans having to sit in the back, having to wait to be served communion, or not even being allowed in the space at all. They go and they kneel and they pray. And the various people there at St. George's Methodist Church physically, violently remove them while they are in the act of prayer. Their faith becomes a protest as they founded a denomination, as they founded a church in which they would be affirmed, in which they could, in fact, pray in the front, in the back, in the balcony, or wherever, but that faith becomes connected to strategies for resistance against enslavement. And why it's so important is because how do you sit with the contradictions that these early men and women of faith encountered, both Christian and Muslim, when they had to deal with the textual authority, a text and scripture used to justify their enslavement, and yet having to use that same text and scripture to explain their belief in a person, in the person of Jesus Christ, their belief that whom God has set free is free indeed. How do you sit with the contradiction of that? And so by their actions of protest, by their leaving St. George's Methodist Church, by the founding of their own denomination, they made active choices about how they were going to read the text. They made choices about whose report they would believe. And then this faith that develops, of course, is praise, as faith is. It is catharsis. It is worship. It is a space to come together in community. It is a place of sanctuary. It is a place, whether it was in the hush harbor or later on in actual buildings and institutional churches, where these enslaved persons came and loved each other in a world that was cruel and hostile and dehumanizing. And that faith and this interfaith cooperation that emerges restored the dignity that was being stripped bit by bit and piece by piece through chattel slavery. So here's the stuff. Okay, students, get ready. Take your notes. It's your lessons. I want us to think about the historical example that I'm using of enslaved persons, the rich religious diversity that it actually represents for this nation, the need, the absolute vital need to cooperate with one another, and the lessons that we today learn. And so there are 3 of them. 3 is just a good number anyway, so there are 3 lessons, so write this down. The first thing is that interfaith work, it depends on a common language. Okay. A common language. So these groups of people came from what we think 50 to 60 different groups, people groups. Right? These enslaved people spoke probably 50 to 60 different languages. Right? They came from different places, different customs, but they needed to create a common language. Now, on one hand, this is utilitarian, right? They needed a common language in order to be able to work, in order to be able to cooperate with one another, in order to be able to do the heavy labor that they were required to do. But I want you to hear this. The common language that developed is crucial to understanding interfaith work, because at the heart of interfaith work is all of us asking, how do we talk about the same sets of questions, the same kinds of human conditions that connect all of us? The person in the hospital dying, whether he or she is Muslim or Jewish or Christian or Buddhist, or they're asking questions about life and death. The kinds of questions that all of us have. Where is God when there is suffering? Those human questions that we ask across faith traditions help us to develop a common language. The best way to do interfaith work is to be able to grapple with a language that we can all use, so that we don't privilege one individual or one group's set of texts, right? But that we actually begin with the premise that there are some pieces of this human experience that we all share in common, and our ability to navigate them, our ability to talk about life and death and love and what is beyond this world and what came before this world and how do we understand the cosmos and where is those questions, that commonality across language, tradition, all of the barriers that divide us were absolutely critical for this group of early African and African American enslaved people, and they're still critical for us today. Our interfaith work requires a common language. Okay, second one, write this down. Interfaith work requires mutual cooperation. All right, this is a hard one because it sounds good. Let's all work together. It's not that easy. As students, those of you who are current students and those of you who have been students, the worst thing in the world is a group project. Now, that's why as professors, we assign them. Because they're going to be lazy people in the group. There's going to be somebody who does all the work and then therefore wants all the credit. That was me. So mutual cooperation is much harder than you think that mutual cooperation should be. But it is the only way that we can do interfaith work. What this is, this image itself, is an image of an underground tunnel in a church in Ohio that was part of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad, this connection, this network of spaces, some sacred and some secular, that helped enslaved people escape from slavery, right? It absolutely required mutual cooperation. It actually required people digging out tunnels. It required some people keeping the secret. It required conductors. So you all have heard the story of Harriet Tubman as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Somebody needed to know where to go, right? Because if it's just a whole network, and so somebody actually needs a map. Someone needs to conduct, right? And so this mutual cooperation, what we know about the Underground Railroad, and if you have an opportunity to go to the Underground Railroad in Ohio, it is amazing, was that a lot of it was religious cooperation. We see Underground Railroad stops at Jewish synagogues, right? As Jewish Americans and rabbis helped enslaved African American Christians escape from chattel slavery. So when I say mutual cooperation, it is absolutely vital for all of our liberation. Something that clicked for those rabbis or the members of that synagogue or those Quakers, something clicked that even though they weren't enslaved, if there were groups of people who didn't have their freedom, then in fact, right, none of us are free. And so that mutual cooperation for them was a result of their faith. Third thing. Interfaith work has to be intergenerational. Now, I know that Gen Z, y'all think you can solve everything. I get it. So you're going to solve all of the crises in the world, and you may, and so thank you. Good luck with that. But I'm here to tell you that the best interfaith work is generational. Part of the reason I sort of steered from my academic writing to write a book about what I learned from my grandmother as this woman of faith was because I understood the church in which I grew up and the faith which I have to be intergenerational, and that's what makes all of the difference. This intergenerational cooperation, how young folk learn, how older folk learn, how we learn from one another. I used to be the young folk in the room, and now those days are going quickly. How we learn from one another. But even more so, when I think about intergenerational cooperation for interfaith work, I'm thinking about what are the legacies that we want to leave, in addition to what are the innovations that we need. But this question of legacy is you don't have to recreate the wheel to do interfaith work, because generations before you, 200 years before we were sitting in this room, there were these groups of Africans learning how to be with one another across generation, across culture, across language, across religious background, in order to survive. Okay, I'm gonna give you a couple of examples, and then I'm gonna give you your homework. This is the first African Baptist church in South Carolina. The first image is of the church as it was built in 1773. The middle image is of the church itself 100 years later, and then the final image is what it looks like today. It was the first physical building that African Americans built to worship. It's a Baptist church, First African Baptist. So it's a very, very special place because it was a building. And even if we understand church to be constituted of people, this building was important. Not only because it served literally as a house of worship, but because in a time and in a place in which it was illegal for African Americans to own property, the building of a church, the setting aside of land for a sacred purpose, and then the deed being held by the trustees of the church was a really significant turning point in African American life. For African Americans, we built churches and schools before we even built our own homes. So this question of faith is absolutely crucial to identity. So this is the first African Baptist church built in 1773. So lovely, still exists. Wow, that's great, because for Americans, we think 1773 was a long time ago. But this is what I want you to do. You go to Europe and they're like, what, yesterday? You're like, okay, so but 1773 is a long time ago. But this is what I want you to see. Hard to see kind of with the light on. But if you go today, you will see at various places that there are holes in the floor. The holes are strategically placed, so they're not random holes. This was the 1780s, so you actually had to do a whole lot of work to make a perfectly round hole. You had to do it with a nail and a hammer, okay? And there are multiple spaces where you see these formations within the church. What are they? They're called the Congo Cosmograms. Now, just let that sink in for a second. African Baptist Church in South Carolina in 1783 has on its floor in the sanctuary multiple holes set in a formation. This is a Star Trek episode for those of you who are Trekkies like I am. Like, okay, what's happening here? Okay. A Congo Cosmogram. This is a distinctly African formation. It comes from the region of West Africa, of which the Bakongo peoples and groups and multiple places and languages. But this is a very ancient practice, this symbol. This symbol suggests the continuity of human life. So the way the image of the church is this one all the way to that side, which is this round circle, and then the cruciform in the middle. We see evidence of this in African pottery and artwork hundreds of years before the transatlantic slave trade. It was a sacred symbol about the cosmos, the physical world, the spiritual world, and then a God who was over the physical and the spiritual world. The question you get to ask is, how did an ancient African symbol end up on the floor of a Baptist church in South Carolina? And the answer to that would be that a Muslim imam helped to create the holes of the symbols on the floor. And those symbols marked, in this particular church, passage to the Underground Railroad. Right? So you have ancient African symbol from traditional African religions. You have a Muslim artisan who actually had the technical skill, right? You had a Christian church, a Baptist church, and then you had Black folk who were all of these things, right? Who were connected to all of these communities, and for whom this represented not just the God who is above, right, all things, but also the God who cared about their freedom and their liberation. This is the power of what it means to take a particular context and say, when interfaith work is taken seriously, the result is freedom. So, the relation of America's racial diversity to its religious diversity, it's a complex and ongoing story. The primary actors in this story have been African Americans who have struggled for racial justice for generations. I simply need you to think about this. Interfaith work is racial justice work. If you're doing interfaith work, you're doing racial justice work. Interfaith work strengthens our own faith journeys. That when you're doing this with integrity for the purposes of human liberation and freedom and thriving and human flourishing, it doesn't threaten your own faith. It doesn't threaten your own set of beliefs. It is actually necessary. So I end with the title, which I never explained, Cradles and Cauldrons. You were waiting for that. See, a good person would take you full circle. Okay. All right, Cradles and Cauldrons. Both of these are artifacts that you will find in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Both of them date from about the same time. This cradle dated to 1820s, made by an enslaved person. And then this large cauldron, this cauldron that was used to produce sugarcane. I was struck when I first started to help collect objects for the museum, and then later when these objects came in and I saw them on display, I was struck in part by their history. Part of their history is that they had been misplaced in another museum because, in fact, certain curators did not believe that African Americans had this level of artisanship this early. Once they were properly credentialed and the provenance and such established, they came over across the street, essentially, to Namak. This cradle, built by an enslaved family, to cradle children that did not legally belong to them, children that could be sold from them. And this cauldron, this object to produce food, this object of labor for a substance that they could not even partake of. And so I sat with kind of the history and the weight of these particular artifacts. But the joy of both of these, which is why I do interfaith work, is that the cradle is the reminder of the need to nurture the next generation of people who are committed to God's justice. We have to nurture another generation of people for whom the work of Micah 6 and 8 resonates in our ears, to walk humbly, but to do justice. It is a verb. And so the cradle is that next generation. And then the cauldron, right? This object of labor, this representation of really the realities of slavery. But like any other large cooking pot, it is about what we do to nurture, the nourishment aspect of it, how we cook, how we nurture our bodies. And we do that in order to survive. And so this cauldron as a symbol of survival, as a reminder that we need one another. These are two domestic symbols. These are two symbols of family life. But family life is beyond our nuclear family. What it means to live in community, what it means to live in a nation with one another, what it means for those of us who are American citizens, right? how are we nourishing another generation? What are we teaching the next generation? How are we taking seriously the commandment to do justice? And how are we making sure that we can celebrate our own rich religious heritage and not at all be threatened by the mutual work and cooperation and understanding of someone else's tradition? This is ultimately the work of faith-seeking understanding. And that is the work to which I am committed, and I thank you for having me here tonight. Thank you. Thank y'all. So, I think I'm allowed to do Q&A. Is that, Dr. Underwood, where did you go? Oh, there you are. Is Q&A? Yes. So again, you may have class, life, jobs, babies, go. But for those of you who can, I'd love to have some time of conversation. And please either come to the mic. I believe there's a mic over here. And love any conversations and questions and feedback. So please feel free. And someone do that, because otherwise I'll feel really awkward up here, all by myself, so. Or you can just shout out from your chair, because I can hear you.
Thank you so much for that. Really appreciated the lecture. The very last thing you talked about with learning about the religious traditions of others and having that not threaten your own religious faith. Can you share a little more about that? Perhaps some experiences you've had where your faith has been deepened by learning more about the religious traditions of others?
Right. I talked about one of the figures who was originally from the nation we now know as Senegal. I've had the opportunity to go to Senegal and other countries in Africa, but this particular story, I was being hosted. I was a graduate student, and I was being hosted by a Muslim family. It's a predominantly Muslim country. And so having a great time, this is wonderful. Because the family that hosted me, in addition to the village where I was staying, everyone around us was Muslim, so the call to prayer rang out like in the town square. And 5 times a day, I watched my Muslim host family stop anything that they were doing, and they prayed. And I gotta tell you, I was so convicted, because my prayer life basically is like, oh, God, I really need a parking spot. This is really, it's just, you know what I mean? It's just like it's just the day-to-day kind of sort of thing. I mean, I believe in prayer, and that's a way, but it's just, and I watched this unfold. I watched my host mother stop cooking. I watched literally small children, as they were learning, stop playing, and they all prayed. And I think about, in my own tradition, we talk about, pray without ceasing. Well, most of us don't do that. We don't even know what that would look like, right? To sort of pray without ceasing. But I share that to say, I learned so much about them and also about myself. I walked away feeling there's so much more I need to do. I didn't walk away feeling threatened. I didn't walk away saying I walked away like, wow, I learned so much. We have so much in common. And I think I am a better Christian because of that time that I spent, right? And so that interfaith work, when it has a liberatory lens to it, is not threatening, because it insists that we come to this as equals. And I'm not trying to change anything about you, but our ability to understand one another helps us to live together. And once I really kind of got a hold of that, it just shifted and transformed something in me. I think I had been raised with something that, the only way to say it is it's sort of kind of fear. It's like, oh no, if you learn too much, or, oh no, if you go over there, oh no, something will happen. That tells me you probably weren't very committed to what you had in the first place, right? But instead, this process of learning together, reading texts together, right? So part of, if you've ever done a faith-seeking understanding group, right, where Christian and Jews or Muslims and Christians, whatever variety of people come together and read the text together. It isn't to convince you that your reading of Abraham is the right one and mine. That's not it at all. It is to say, what do I learn through the lens of someone else's experience and way of knowing, right? That enhances how I understand who God is. And so that liberatory lens for me is really, really critical. That it isn't just to do it because you think that's a nice thing to do, but you do it because you value the dignity and worth of every person. And that dignity and worth of every person, that the God breath in every person, means you get to take their experiences, their stories, their faith very seriously. So that's an example that's just stayed with me for a long time since I was a graduate student. Thank you for that question. I appreciate that. Hi. You might turn it on. Is it on? But if not, I can hear you and I can repeat your question. Or use your big voice.
There we go.
Can you hear me now?
I do.
Okay. So you mentioned how your own ancestry was descended from slaves that came across from the Atlantic. Did you kind of understand that there was such a diverse interfaith within your own culture growing up? And if not, what impact did learning this have on you?
No, I didn't know that at all. It's again sort of just how we tell the American story, right? We sort of tell it through Plymouth Rock and the Pilgrims, and so that you understand America's understanding of itself as a Christian nation. I'll put it that. I have some debate with that, but its understanding of itself as a Christian nation, because you actually have to act like Christ to be okay. So that's what I knew. That's what I learned. That's what you're just taught in school. So I didn't know. I just knew that basically every black person I knew was a Christian. That was it. Right? Now, you get older and you meet people from different religious traditions, and then you're like, oh, well, where and how and what? So I had no clue whatsoever about not only just the African-American story, but America's story, right? That Rhode Island was the first place that they built a synagogue. Like, Rhode Island? Like, really? Like, yes, right? And so there was a synagogue in the 17th century. And but we don't tell, right? You hear the Pilgrims and Plymouth Rock and the Mayflower, and all of that is true, and all of these other stories are true as well. That there is a richness to how religion developed in early America. And part of why we don't tell the story, I think, is because the lions don't write history. The hunters write it. And so peoples from marginalized groups, or people from groups whose own stories and histories include oppression and persecution, they didn't get to write that story of early America. This is new. As historians and folks who do work in religion and across different fields are filling in the pieces and the gaps. It excites me because what it means is that we are a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy, and we should celebrate that. And if we celebrate that, we also should get it right. Right. Mm-hmm.
And then just kind of a follow-up. Did you mourn when you learned that identity had been stripped from you your life?
There is a grief to that, because there is a grief to knowing that you can only go so far with some of your history and some of your lineage. There is a grief to what the writer Toni Morrison describes so eloquently, the bones littered on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, right? There is a grief to knowing people groups being stripped of their names and cultures and customs. So there is a grieving to that, and there should be, right? But there is also, for me, a profound gratitude for the resilience and survival of my ancestors. That people always say, you know, oh, I would have done this, I wouldn't have survived. So I am thankful for the resiliency, the survival, whatever it was that they found, and I believe they found it primarily through their faith, to survive life, to give birth to another generation, to pass down stories and history and legacy. So profound gratitude as well. Thank you. Sir.
Hi. First, I want to thank you again personally for coming and sharing your experiences and your scholarship with us. Your comments about language really resonated with me. As a composer of new music that deals in challenging the boundaries between genres, this is a really crucial question for me. It's what I deal with every day. So my question is, how can we go about moderating our language, and how do we learn new and more universal words that can both serve to affirm our faith and also affirm those of others without marginalizing anybody and being as inclusive as possible?
Right, thank you, that's a great question. So here's an incomplete answer. I mean, again, if I had all of the answers, then I would bottle them and sell them and retire. But here's at least a partial answer. We hold so many things in common that a language that can have both our commonality and our differences and can live in the tension of that, right? And I say live in the tension because as soon as it gets uncomfortable, then people want to kind of stop, right? But we have to have tension in order to really be in relationship with one another, right? And so tension is okay. Hard conversations are okay. Difficult words are also okay. And we have to be fine with the tension of that. We have to humble ourselves enough to be silent and let others speak. We have to yield the mic sometimes, right? We have to give space to a wide variety of views, even if we disagree with them. And that's actually very, very hard. I like the mic, so I like to talk. This is, you don't become a professor unless you just, so the yielding of the mic, the walking in a humility to hear someone else. My daughter and her generation, I love it. They're like, you could just say nothing. I'm like, oh, right? Sometimes you could just be quiet. And so by literally being quiet and giving people who often are not given the opportunity to speak, you might learn something. And so sometimes we just need to be quiet. Sometimes we just need to be humble and let the conversation happen without us directing it or trying to steer it along. The second part of the answer is you mentioned music. We have lots of ways to do language, right? This is language, conversation, speech is language, but the people who do musical therapy, music is language. I love Beyonce. If you want to talk to me about Beyonce, we can talk about anything else, because if you have a Beyonce conversation, we're good, right? Like there's a way in which how we do music, really, it's transformative. You mentioned the person after whom this lecture is named, and the Tabernacle Choir. I'm a little black girl from Brooklyn, and I know that choir. How? Because there's something about the music that goes much further than the theology. There are people who come and they hear African-American gospel music, or at Howard, we usually annually do a program of spirituals. And I have watched people who have no religious background at all weep. They're hearing something. Now, I'm a Christian. I believe it's the Holy Spirit. It's okay if that's what you know, that's okay. But something's happening that allows us to be in a space where we're sharing. That's what language has the capacity to do. And that's what I mean by saying everyone has the same sets of questions. You meet a 13-year-old in any nation, country, under every religion, they're all terrible. Have you met a 13-year-old? They're terrible, okay? And you're like, what? Because there's something about the growing into adolescence and what's happening and my body's doing, where they have the same sets of questions, right? So it means that we have common spaces with these profoundly human questions that allow us to enter into dialogue with one another.
Thank you.
No, thank you. It's great. Yeah.
Hi. So, I'm close. Okay, I'll have to go down a little bit. So my question is, as a queer person at BYU, something that I think a lot about is what interfaith dialogue and the 3 principles that you shared with us, what that looks like in the context of oppression. Because of course that's the narrative that we discussed, slavery, discrimination. So could you just comment a little bit on like what we can do to bridge that gap that oppression creates?
Absolutely. So one of the things I've suggested is that people can share their stories, but let me press even that to say that I believe that real interfaith conversations can happen when people show up with their full selves, right? And their full selves, whether it is their sexual identity, their racial identity, whatever it is, their full selves. I'm going to enter into a space as the vessel that God has made me. I didn't choose it, but it's here, and I'm good. We're good. We've negotiated over the years, and we're good, right? And so I don't want to enter into a space that says to me I have to silence myself because I'm Black or because I'm a woman, or because that is absolutely then a space saying to me that I cannot respect the fullness of your humanity. And so where you find space to bring your full self, your whole self, all of the pieces of you, those are spaces that are going to be healthy and healing and transformative. If those spaces are saying that you have to hide any part of yourself in order to be here, then they're not ready for you. And so creating healing, transformative, life-giving communities, it is difficult to do because we want it to look like what we think it should look like, right? And sound like a certain way. We want it to be neat and clean, and instead it's messy and dirty and complicated, and we don't know, and it's fuzzy and it's gray, and we agree and we disagree. I was raised in a denomination, unlike some Christian denominations, some others, where this particular denomination doesn't affirm women for pastoral ministry. And I grew up with women who had powerful pastoral ministry gifts, and they had to leave. Sometimes you leave. But also, I stayed, because sometimes you stay to make the difference. And only God can tell you whether you leave or whether you stay, but we need voices on the outside and we need voices on the inside. Y'all, nobody liked the biblical prophets. I hope you all get that, right? The biblical prophets, no one liked them. Many of them had to stand outside the gates of the city and like yell over the wall, and people with rocks throwing at them. But they had a prophetic word, and that's what they had to do. So some of us choose to remain. It is difficult for me sometimes to remain in Christian spaces because those Christian spaces have been harmful and racist and sexist and patriarchal. And I remember going through a phase where I just think, wow, if these people are Christians, I'm not sure I want to even be, because you say to yourself, how can we be? I chose to remain. But I also know people of great integrity who said, I have to find a different way, right? And we need both of those. We're always going to need critics. We're going to need people to hold us to our best selves, to call us to repentance. And then we're going to need people who say, I'm going to stay and roll up my sleeves, and if it's going to change, it's going to change because I'm staying here, and I am going to be the person that is the gadfly, and you're going to change because you're just annoyed at me. I just choose to do that. That's my particular calling, to be annoying, and maybe things will change if I'm annoying enough, right? But we need that. I just want you, I want everyone to show up with your full self.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, Dr. Pierce. As a woman of color and faculty, it's so healing to see an older a mentor, right? Because we don't see that as much, right? That I can talk to and identify with. But my question is this: as someone who is also a woman of faith and a faculty member in an academic setting with students of faith, we have students sometimes that come to us in a crisis of faith.
Yes.
Right? They're having a faith crisis. And I'm wondering if you experience that at your institution as well, and what kind of advice you give as their faculty member when they come to you with that.
Yes, I tell them I have my own faith crises, and so let us share with one another. That absolutely happens, right? Of course, it happens. And I think that's a healthy thing. I actually think that those kinds of things are healthy. The asking of questions, the crisis itself. I feel sympathy and empathy for them when they're struggling, but I think having it is healthy because it means that they're asking questions, right? They're thinking, they're being critical, they're critiquing. And that's where the work has to get done. So part of my response is to say, I'm here with you, I'm here for you, I'm willing to listen, I'm willing to be an advocate in whatever way. As a faculty member, I need to be an advocate, but I also tell them, don't be afraid, right? Of this crisis, of the questions that you have. Some questions we won't get answered in this lifetime. Like, let's just be honest. Like, I have questions, okay? So I'm like, I'm just keeping a list, because I might not get them answered in this lifetime, but I'm gonna struggle and challenge. And so when you are honest and you can share your moments of doubt, when you can share when you may have walked away or thought about walking away, and when you can assure a person that everything that they're experiencing and feeling is the wrestling. We're taught to wrestle. That is a part and process of it. And to give them space to be able to do that, I think that that is all that we can do. I can't solve it for you. I might not even have the right words. One of the things I'm learning myself is to sometimes just sit silently sometimes and just hold someone's hand. Like, I want to come up with the magic formula. Actually, maybe. Whatever we want to say about Job's friends, for 7 days, they just sat there quietly. Just knowing this ministry of presence sometimes really makes the difference. Because usually when you're going through that crisis, you feel alone. And so I'm just going to sit here with you until you're ready. This is the larger question for me, is about, you all had an academic institution with a faith component, right? That this is foundational. Then it's much more than just, this is what I teach. Because if it was just that, you could be anywhere, right? You can get a PhD, you can just go get an academic job. This is about how you understand your own sense of ministry. you're not just helping to teach that person psychology or history or Spanish or whatever the subject is, but that you care about the whole person who is being formed. And so what for me is at the heart and the beauty of schools, faith-based schools, is that spiritual formation is on the curriculum. Right? It's on the curriculum. It isn't something that we hope someone does over there. It is something that is a part and parcel of our everyday reality. So thank you for the work that you do here for that.
This is wonderful that there are many questions that we would still love to discuss, but it's 11 o'clock at night.
Really?
Thank all of you for being here. We have a presentation from President Worth and Dr. Pierce.
Let me just, on behalf of everyone, thank you again, Dr. Pierce, for being here, for spending time with us, for the answers to your questions that you received, and for your example of interfaith, strengthening of faith of everyone engaged in that process. We have here. Okay. Appreciation for that, and we remind with fondness and hope, as I told you before, you have another chance to come out here and spend some time with us. So thank you very much.